Now, that's actually the theory component, why we need theories to understand anything in life. We'll do this next week. That's our Science of IR week. But one of the things that I would like you to keep in mind is that without a theory, okay, or any form of an analytical framework, everything you see around you just becomes only images, haphazard things that you wouldn't be able to basically understand, explain, predict what might happen in the next step, or they would just remain as unconnected events that only make sense, well, some sense at least on their own. So we need theories. In your book, you have a classification of different approaches and different theories to understand international relations, which we call images. Okay? Now, there is actually something important here. By the end of the semester, you will be able to identify different theories, what their assumptions are, what their explanations actually are. So the three groups that you will be familiar with at the end of the semester are the three basic paradigms in international relations. Realism, which we will devote something like, I think, 3 to 4 weeks. Pluralism, which is a larger umbrella that puts together liberalism and decision-making and psychological theories, and globalism. Okay? Now, you could also have a path of some sort with which you can actually find the connection of these images to specific philosophers whom you might be learning in your political philosophy classes. So realism could be traced back to Niccolo Machiavelli, which you will again read bits and pieces. Neredeydik? Images. Realism, pluralism, globalism. What was the sentence that I left you off with? The philosophers. Okay? So realism, I said you can trace it back to Machiavelli, but more so, realism is the Hobbesian tradition. Okay? So it's Thomas Hobbes. You already learned a little bit of Thomas Hobbes last year in your SPS classes, but for our IR theory, okay, Thomas Hobbes is basically, and his nature of mankind approach, forms the basis of the realist paradigm. Okay? Pluralism, you can trace that back to Immanuel Kant. Right? Kant, the perpetual peace argument, the different aspects of human nature that he emphasizes in contrast to Hobbes. And globalism is traced back to Karl Marx, who basically tells you that economic determinism, economic factors shape everything. Okay? So three traditions. Think of these as three traditions in IR theory. Hobbesian, Kantian, Marxist. Okay? Hobbesian tradition gives you the realist paradigm. And I'll explain what a paradigm is. The Kantian, can you close the door? There's too much. Okay. The Kantian tradition gives you the framework for the pluralist paradigm, but pluralism is not actually a term that I like to use that much. I think they're using it in your book. You could actually use liberalism instead. Okay? So take Kantian and associate that with liberalism. And globalism, the Marxist approach, which basically gives you the economic determinist framework. Now, before we go into these images, let's talk a little bit about who the actors in international relations are. Now, you've already seen in the pictures in the previous hour, okay, that we actually look into state behavior. Okay? When wars occur, okay, the wars that occur actually take place among states. So we have to actually look into states as one of the actors. But I've basically shown you the pictures of, for example, the Bosnian genocide or massacre, whatever you want to call it, you don't have actually a state involvement in the same format as World War I and World War II in the Bosnian War. It takes place within the Bosnian state, so you have sub-state actors, okay, individuals who become the main players. Okay? So it's not only states that act as actors, but we also have non-state actors, individuals and sub-state actors that would all be grouped in there. And we have two different types of organizations that cross-cut and operate across boundaries. Okay? So let's start. So these are the actors. Okay? States, non-state actors, transnational organizations, intergovernmental organizations. So you will actually see this again in the third week of classes. But what forms a piece of territory, okay, which has, a piece of land, which has a group of people living on that piece of land, which has some form of internal organization, which we call a government. So three concrete elements. You need land. You need to have people on the land. You wouldn't have horses or goats, which could be the case sometimes in international relations, because Kardak Islands turned out to be an important piece of land of contemplation between the Greeks and the Turks. The only thing that lived on the Kardak Islands were a bunch of goats. So you need to have people on that land. And there has to be some form of government, an internal organization. Okay? Now, even with these three concrete elements, think of these as tangible elements of statehood, okay? Things you can hold, touch, measure, see with your eyes. They're empirical data, okay? They are there that you can quantify, okay? But they are not enough. Even if you have these three elements, government, territory, people, you need to have something more to transform that entity into what we call a state. And these two more elements, which are the critical elements of statehood, is, as Alican have said, diplomatic recognition, which is not necessarily that much tangible, not as tangible as land, and as Tolga have said, sovereignty. Okay? So diplomatic recognition, other states need to recognize you as a separate state which has international presence. Okay? How do you get diplomatic recognition? Okay? Let's assume Alican wants to establish the independent Republic of Tuzla. No? So he basically organizes everybody in Tuzla, okay? And then says, we are declaring our independence from the Turkish government. What's the next step? How does he get diplomatic recognition? Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, 1983, says, I am now a separate state. I'm not part of the Republic of Cyprus. This has nothing to do with me. From now on, Rauf Denktaş says, Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus is an independent, sovereign state. Okay? How many years have passed from 1983? Almost 30. Okay? 29 years have passed. So, what's the problem? What didn't he get? Well, he didn't get, as Alican said, diplomatic recognition. But where would that diplomatic recognition lie? Okay? Same thing happened in 1990. Okay? In 1990, when Yugoslavia was, basically dissolving, Croatia. Okay? Croatia today is an independent sovereign state. Croatia said in 1990, well, I'm no longer a part of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. I have a land, people, government, and I'm declaring my independence. Okay? I am now separating myself from the Republic of, the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. So, 7 years apart, 1983, Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus says, I'm independent, I break away from South Cyprus, okay, or Republic of Cyprus. 1990, Croatia does the same thing. Okay? What does Croatia get that the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus could not get? No, Yugoslavia didn't accept. Milosevic was in power, and Milosevic was saying, no, everything has to be Serbian. Okay? So how did Croatia, became independent and diplomatically recognized? What do you think could be the factor that Croatia could use that never actually could be used by the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus? What do you think could be the critical differentiating variable here? Exactly. Very good, Alican. The UN. Okay? But what happened in the Croatian case, Germany in 1990 said, yes, this is a great idea. We recognize Croatia. Okay? And once Germany recognized, Croatia was also able to, apply to the UN and get UN recognition. Leave the gray areas aside. You have more or less concrete, tangible elements to understand a political entity that you look at as states. So most international relations has traditionally evolved through state-to-state interactions. Okay? Now, the paradigms that we are going to analyze, realism, for example, okay, which is the dominant paradigm, has a very strong and key assumption. Okay? Realism says the only thing that matters if you want to understand international politics is the states themselves. Okay? So realism is a state-centric paradigm. Okay? It's a state-centric because anything beyond the states, which is beyond the states, which actors, non-state actors, intergovernmental organizations, what have you, don't play an important role in international politics. The only actors that you should look at to understand international politics are the states. Okay? In contrast, okay, pluralism will say, no, not necessarily. Okay? Pluralism will say, but there are also other actors. Non-state actors play a role. Individuals matter. Okay? Who the president of a government is, whether it's Bush or Obama or Clinton, will change American foreign policy. Okay? For pluralism. So individuals matter. Individuals are non-state actors. Similarly, okay, sub-state groups, which I didn't yet describe, matter. Okay? Intergovernmental organizations, transnational organizations matter. You don't know what they are. Globalism, same thing. Globalism says, well, states are important, yes, but the interactions between states are shaped by something else over which they don't have full control. Okay? Those are basically the transnational actors, specifically for globalism, the multinational companies. Okay? So globalism says, well, since economics shape everything, and there are actors that operate on economic concerns beyond the states, the multinational companies, McDonald's, IBM, what have you, would play a role in shaping state behavior. So these three paradigms, one thing for you to understand, these three paradigms, sets of theories, differ from one another based on the relative weight they assign to the actors. Okay? So realism, the most important actor is the state. Anything beyond, that's not important. Okay? They might exist, but they don't shape international politics. Okay? Pluralism says, no, we have other factors playing in. Okay? Yes, states matter, but other actors also shape international politics. So what are these other actors? Okay? What's a non-state actor? Well, am I a state? No, I'm an individual. Can I shape international politics? Depends on the theory you're looking at. Okay? Depends on your perspective. So a non-state actor is an individual. Okay? That's the simplest one. Okay? Every individual is a non-state actor. They are not, they don't have a territory, they don't have a land, they don't have a government, they don't have organization, they don't have recognition. So every individual is a non-state actor. So when you look at, for example, the, let's say, impact of individuals have Okay? It could be a private individual, okay? Somebody like, I don't know, Bob Geldof, who organized these peace concerts. Okay? He had an impact on international politics according to pluralism. Okay? So individuals is one non-state actor. Okay? You also have, for example, sub-state actors. Okay? There are, sub-state means below the state. Okay? The bodies that make up the state. For example, the military. Yeah? The military is a sub-state actor. It's not the state. Okay? If the military is the key holder of foreign policy making in a country, then it would basically show you that the relative power of one organ of the state becomes the key mechanism to understand how foreign policy is made. Or alternatively, in United States, the Israeli lobby in United States. That's a sub-state actor. Okay? It's not part of the state, but the Israeli lobby is able to influence individual congressmen in the American legislature through various lobbying activities and steer American foreign policy towards Israeli interests rather than, let's say, the American self-interest. Okay? So we have, for example, a couple of years ago, a very good article published by John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt, who were in University of Chicago and Harvard University respectively, on the role of the Israeli lobby in American foreign policy that later on turned into a book where both Mearsheimer and Walt, both of them are realists, okay? They are in core realist paradigm, argued that since the Israeli lobby, a sub-state actor, non-state actor, became very powerful in American politics, the American foreign policy is sacrificing or is harming the overall American national self-interest by more or less alienating the Middle Easterns, by alienating the Arab populations in the Middle East. Okay? So you have here a very good illustration of the non-state actor, a lobby group, for example, trying to influence overall international relations. Intergovernmental organizations are all organizations that have states as their members. Okay? So can you give me an example of an intergovernmental organization? Its members are governments. Governments form these organizations for certain things. Okay? It could be as narrow as a postal union, or it could be as general as the United Nations. No? So the UN is an intergovernmental organization. UN members are individual states. Okay? I don't walk to the UN and say, ring on its bell and say, I want to be a member of the United Nations. Okay? You can only be a member of the UN if you are a state. Okay? And the UN is very, very general. Okay? It has many different organs and parts, but it's basically a very general intergovernmental organization. But we have others. Give me examples. The EU is an intergovernmental organization, not maybe. The EU is an intergovernmental organization because its members are the states. What else? Huh? NATO. NATO is an intergovernmental organization, but compared to the UN, NATO is much narrow. Okay? UN has all-encompassing membership. Okay? EU and NATO have narrow memberships. Okay? So there is, for example, a distinction between intergovernmental organizations based on who could become members. No? So membership restrictions matter in intergovernmental organizations, but EU, NATO, and UN all go under the same umbrella of intergovernmental organizations, which are institutions that have a specific charter, a specific set of rules that are formed for a specific purpose. Why is the UN created, by the way? When was the UN created? 1945. Who were the founding members of the UN? No, you could. Well, that also is a. I know what you're trying to say. What's your name? Okay, not the victorious ones. Okay, all states that declared war on Germany in 1945 were invited to this conference in San Francisco, where a new institution was discussed that would implement the rules of international system, basically the Westphalian Order, which again I think is I'm going to discuss on the third week. Turkey, for example, was Turkey part of World War II? Did we participate in World War II? We did not. We stayed neutral. But 1 week before the war was over, in order to qualify to become one of the founding members of the United Nations, Turkey declared war on Germany. Okay? So the Turkish government went to the San Francisco conference, okay, where they established the United Nations. So victorious is not exactly the correct word. The UN was put together and founded based on collective security principle, which you don't know yet, by all the states who declared war on Germany during World War II. Okay? NATO, by contrast, is much, much, much, much narrower. Okay? It had, when it was created, only about 8 members. Today, NATO is 28 countries. Okay? But all the members of NATO, the North Atlantic, basically, treaty organization, had one common purpose when it was created in 1949, which was to stop Soviet aggression or Soviet expansion into Europe. Okay? Now, Russia just became a member to the World Trade Organization, WTO. Okay? Do you think that's an intergovernmental organization? Yes. What does it do? How many of you have shoes made in China? Look at them. I'm sure all of you are wearing shoes made in China. Converse made in China. All your sneakers made in China. I don't know, Nine West made in China. Everything you're wearing, most probably your jeans, made in China. So, the pencils you're using, made in China. The cap you're wearing, most probably made in China. Eyeglasses, made in China. How many of you carry iPhones? iPhones, let me see your hands. iPads, made in China. Right? They're all made in China. So, how are all these things made in China are in your hands? Did you go to China? You have been recently in China? So why is everything more or less that you buy comes from China? Aside from the obvious that they are now the leading manufacturer, but how did you buy that stuff? Phyllis, Deniz Phyllis. Okay, Deniz, go ahead.
It's just like globalization, the exchange of goods between the countries, and the WTO just oversees all that.
Okay, WTO actually brings that rule. If I was asking the same question 50 years ago, if we had this class 50 years ago in the same format, you would all be wearing things that are made where? Made in Turkey, exactly. That whatever we're lecturing, it would be more or less domestic. So over time, trade has expanded in the world. And we have certain rules that basically, well, as Deniz have said, oversees, but regulates trade. Okay? The operation that we have in international economics rests on the principles of free trade. Okay? And free trade means elimination of restrictions on, let's say, taxes, restrictions on quantity, quotas, and the integration of the whole world into a freely trading entity. WTO is an outcome of that principle. Do you think WTO has existed all the way in the past 50 years? How old do you think WTO is?
1995.
Very good. Very good. So it was created in 1995. But at the end of World War II, we actually see a treaty called the GATT Treaty, General Agreement on Trade and Tariff, which brings the free trade rules, which over time evolved into the WTO. Now, today, all the states in the world that want to be integrated into the world market are members of the WTO. Chinese membership was problematic. It became a member. Russia was one of the few large economies in the world that was not a WTO member. They just joined a couple of months ago. So WTO, however, is not, it doesn't come based on the rule that anybody who wants to be in could be in. Okay? It has, again, rules. Okay? Rules that states who want to become members of WTO has to abide, has to basically abide by, has to obey. Turkey, by being a WTO member, brought down its tariff walls. Okay? It brought down the taxes it imposes, let's say, on products that you could import from China. Okay? So before WTO membership, let's say we had very high taxes to textiles coming from China. Once the WTO rules kicked in, those walls came down. So products that are made in China enter the Turkish market freely and without very high taxes. So you can, that means then there is actually a replacement of products that are imported with what is made inside. So the world has become largely interdependent. Okay? But what matters for this lecture is this. Okay? We have organizations in the world which are established for specific functions. Okay? That could be collective defense. That is committing its members to their mutual defense. That's NATO. Collective defense. If anybody attacks a NATO member, today Syria attacks Turkey. Okay? That attack from a third party will be made collectively by all the NATO countries. Okay? So a third party that's planning to attack Turkey would not do so because it knows it will have to fight with all the NATO members. That's a function, a narrow function, collective defense. Trade, another narrow function. Okay? WTO is created to have certain rules on the whole world on free trade. Okay? Postal Union, Intergovernmental Organization. What does Postal Union do? For example, when Dilara sends a letter to her friend in the United States, she assumes when she puts the letter in the postal box, it will eventually go to the United States. Okay? What made that possible is the Postal Union, okay? To which all the countries in the world basically join and say, yes, we accept the rules of free communications for all, and we will basically obey whatever decisions are made within that organization so that we could all have free flow of mail. Okay? So it could be narrow, Postal Union, or it could be general, the United Nations. Okay? But one thing that is clear is that when governments come together for a joint purpose, okay, and form another entity, that entity that they form, which we call an intergovernmental organization, has a higher jurisdiction over the individual states with respect to that specific issue. Okay? So once Russia becomes a WTO member, Russia cannot say today, okay, the rules of WTO don't apply in Russia. Okay? So Russia basically gives up some of its competencies on setting the rules for trade to WTO. So the WTO turns to Russia and says, well, you have to lower your tariff walls to products coming from, let's say, China. Okay? Russia cannot say no once it basically becomes a member of WTO. Now, transnational organizations. Today, intergovernmental organizations are around, well, the ones that matter are around 5,000, but in numbers they are close to 20,000. Okay? There are about 20 to 30,000, I think, intergovernmental organizations. What's a transnational organization? Do you think Al-Qaeda is a transnational organization? Al-Qaeda. What is Al-Qaeda? None of you heard of the Al-Qaeda? What is it? How do you define the Al-Qaeda? It's a terrorist group, exactly. Now, where does Al-Qaeda basically have its headquarters? We don't know. Nobody knows. Okay? So we don't know the headquarters. Okay? Does Al-Qaeda have operations in Iraq? Does it have operations in Kenya? Does it have operations in Pakistan, Syria, United States, certain parts of Europe? Yes. Okay? So its operations cross-cut boundaries. Okay? It has members from different nationalities. It has operations. It's an operation exactly like McDonald's. Okay? It's a different form of an operation, but it's an operation. So it has operations across the boundaries. Therefore, it's a transnational organization. Okay? What about McDonald's? Is McDonald's a transnational organization? Do we have McDonald's in China? Yes, we have McDonald's all over the world. And it's actually a multinational organization. All multinational companies, MNCs, okay? Which basically means a company that has a branch in another country aside from its home country. No? So any country, any company, okay, Koç, Sabancı, Eczacıbaşı, Enka, okay, they all have branches in different parts of the world. Okay? They're all multinationals. So any company that has a branch in another country other than its home country is a multinational corporation. All MNCs, all multinational corporations are transnational organizations. Okay? All terrorist organizations that operate in multiple areas are transnational organizations. What else is a transnational organization? Give me one more example. What comes to your mind? Huh?
Gazprom.
No. Why not? No? Gazprom is Russian. It's based in Russia, and it sells gas to other countries. So it's not a multinational company. Doesn't have to be an MNC, but all MNCs, all multinational companies, McDonald's, IBM, Koç, what have you, are transnational. Okay? All terrorist groups are transnational. Give me another type of an organization that maybe you guys are members to that is also transnational. Greenpeace, precisely. How did you find it out when I said you guys might be members to, right? Greenpeace. Okay? It's a transnational organization. It has, you know, multiple operations in multiple different countries. Who are the members of Greenpeace, by the way? Yeah, go ahead. You are, no. Okay, you are. Individuals. Individuals. Okay, very good. You're a member of the Greenpeace. Greenpeace membership is individual-based. Tamam? Transnational organization. So if you want to, for example, look for a key to differentiate between transnational and intergovernmental, membership would be that key. Individuals are members, governments are members. Tamam? So if it's a transnational organization, individuals are members. Okay? So what was your name? Bouquet? Bouquet is a member of the Greenpeace, but Bouquet cannot be a member of the WTO. Okay? She has to be a state to be a member of the WTO. Amnesty International, okay? İnsan Hakları, İnsan Affı Örgütü, Amnesty International. That's a transnational organization to which individuals are members to. What about the church? Catholic Church. Do you think that's a transnational organization?
Is it a sovereign state?
The Catholic Church? Vatican is a sovereign state. Well, Vatican is not actually a sovereign state. Vatican is one of the gray areas, because if you want to go to Vatican, you have to go through where? Italy. So it does not control who gets in and out, okay, in the form of a passport control, but it has diplomatic recognition. So we have, for example, an ambassador, a Turkish ambassador to Vatican. Okay? So Vatican is another gray area. But I'm not asking about Vatican. I'm asking about the Catholic Church. Do you think that's a transnational organization? Its individuals are members to it. It operates across different countries, and it's a transnational organization. Okay? So the differentiating element, if both of these, both transnational and intergovernmental organizations, operate across boundaries, okay, in multiple different countries, the differentiating element is for transnational, membership is individual based. For intergovernmental, only governments could be members to. But both cross-cut boundaries, both operate in multiple areas. Now, a key element for us in IR theory is different theories, okay, look at these actors in a different way. That's very critical. Right? For specific theories such as realism, even though these might exist, so realists say, yes, we have non-state actors, we have MNCs, we have WTO, what have you, but their role in international politics is limited, according to realism. What matters in realism is the states. Pluralists say, no, they play as an equal role as states do. So it gives relative and equal weight. When you go to globalism, globalism will tell you that multinational companies rule the world, okay? That they tell, multinational companies tell the states what to do. So from a globalist perspective, states are not the key decision makers, they are tools for multinational companies for the generation of profits worldwide, and the states become the tools of oppressing the less developed countries' public so that the big businesses basically generate profits. Okay? So from a globalist perspective, the actor that matters the most is the transnational organizations. Okay? From a realist perspective, the actor that matters the most is the state. From a pluralist perspective, it's divided equally between them depending upon which theory of pluralism you're actually looking into. So actors matter, and actors shape, well, the way that different theories view the actors enable us to differentiate between them, and they also shape your ability to explain international politics. Now, one of the important things that I want you to basically be very aware of and more or less, comprehend this during our semester together is the fact that who the actors are and what kind of a relative weight they have in international politics changes from one angle, from one theory, one image to the other, okay? So one of the key things that is important for you is, and I stressed this a little on Tuesday, in the last few minutes, I think, what kind of actors play, what kind of a role changes from one theory to the other, or they have a different perception of that. And this in return, and you will see this clearly as we go along, this in return forms one of the main distinctions, okay, one of the key distinctions between the images of IR that we discussed, okay, or that we are now going to discuss. So a key distinction between these images are, is the actors, and basically the actors are the units of analysis, okay? What you choose to focus in order to understand, for example, war, okay? Let me give you an example. Okay? When Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990, okay? There was an invasion of Iraq in 1990 where they marched into Kuwait and they said, well, Kuwait is no more. There is no more a state called Kuwait. This is now a part of Iraq. Okay? Now, this is an international relations event. There is an invasion. There is a war where a sovereign state invades another state and declares it no longer exists. Okay? Now, if you want to explain this okay, when you try to explain this, when an IR theorist try to explain, okay, what causes the invasion, there are number of ways you can explain this, okay? You can say, well, Saddam Hussein was a crazy guy, okay? He was basically a dictator. It's him alone, who is responsible for the invasion of Kuwait. Come on. So your key actor, okay, the main unit of analysis, right? This is, you go back here, the one key actor, your main unit of analysis is what? Saddam. He is the individual, okay? So you focus on the individual. You say Kuwait was invaded because Iraq was under the rule of Saddam Hussein, okay? Dictator, crazy ruler, what have you, okay? Similarly, you can say, well, World War II occurred because Germany was ruled by Hitler, who was again a dictator, crazy, what have you, okay? You can say in 1945, when the Yalta Agreement, which you don't know yet about, is signed, okay? Part of the reason why in Yalta the United States said yes to the Soviet demands was because the American president at the time, Franklin Roosevelt, was sick. Okay? So again, individual level analysis, you're attributing an outcome, the Yalta outcome, to the individual, but not necessarily his personality, but his health status at that time. Okay? So what you have here is this. Okay? You can say in international relations, the cause of a specific event, it could be war, it could be a peace treaty, it could be the emergence of an institution, okay? It could be withdrawal from, let's say, an area you have invaded before. Any type of a decision that involves international relations, you can basically argue that you can explain this by focusing on who the leader is at that given period of time. Okay? So your unit of analysis, the main focus, you want to understand Turkey's Syrian foreign policy today, you look at the key foreign policy maker. Okay? You want to understand the American decision to invade Iraq in 2003, you look at George W. Bush. Okay? You want to understand the Libyan intervention in 2011, you look at the leading country, France, in that, and Sarkozy's personality, who was the president of France at the time, is the key to understand what made that intervention possible. Okay? So if your unit of analysis, if your main focus is the individual, okay, we call this the individual level analysis. Okay? So this is also important in the sense that this gives you the first image of IR. Okay? We call this the first image of IR. If you want to understand something that takes place in international relations, you look at the person responsible. Okay? Either his personality, his background, his perceptions, okay? His mental and emotional health, Roosevelt in Yalta. Okay? And in the first image, that's the individual level analysis. Your key actor is the person. Okay? Now, this, for example, if your key actor is the person, and this is your unit of analysis, this type of a focus does not have a place in realism. Okay? So realists, traditional realists, don't think that who the leader is at any given period of time is actually going to make a difference with respect to states' foreign policy. Okay? So for realists, it wouldn't really matter if you had, let's say, Clinton or Bush in power in 2001 when September 11 occurred, okay? And the response to an attack against American soil would not be shaped and dictated by their personality and who they are, but it would be dictated by the state's general national self-interest. Okay? So one thing that's clear here. If you're a realist, you don't basically look into individual level analysis. Okay? So for classical realists, who the person leading a country at any given period of time has almost no role, okay? Very little role in shaping the foreign policy of that country, okay? Remember, we are trying to differentiate between the images: realism, pluralism, globalism. One way to differentiate between them is to look at their unit of analysis, what they choose to analyze. Okay? So if, for example, I ask you a question, you know, why did Iraq invaded Kuwait? And Ali Jans tells me, well, it was because Iraq at the time was ruled by Saddam Hussein, who had complete control over Iraq, who was a dictator. There was, you know, no other force that could balance him. And he was also a very ambitious and extremely, let's say, crazy leader who, you know, just marched into Kuwait and annexed Kuwait to Iraq. Would that be a valid explanation? Would I? No. Would that be a valid explanation in general in IR theory? Yes. Okay. What was your name? Faisas. Point. It would not be perfect point. It would not be a valid explanation for the realists. Okay? So if you're a realist, okay, let's assume I'm a realist and Ali Can comes from the pluralist framework. So we sat together and try to understand the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. Ali Can says, well, it's because of Saddam. And I say, no, it has nothing to do with Saddam. It has to do with Iraqi national self-interest. Okay? So Ali Can's explanation comes from the individual level analysis. Okay? My explanation comes from the second one, the state level analysis. Okay? But these are both equally valid explanations. Okay? We don't necessarily agree, and this is actually something that you will learn better next week. We don't necessarily agree. Okay? He thinks it's the individual, I say it's the state. Okay? But we are both explaining the very same thing. Okay? We are both trying to understand why was there an invasion. Okay? And the next step we actually do in order to understand that, we choose, you know, since we are two different people coming from two different theoretical frameworks, backgrounds, let's say, we choose different units of analysis. Okay? So in international relations, we have actually 3 different levels of analysis. Okay? These, you're seeing them. They're called the first image, the second image, and the third image. Tied to what we discussed on Tuesday, the key element between the first, second, and third image, that is individual state and system level analysis, is who the key actors are and what their unit of analysis is. Okay? And they're actually, you know, very self-explanatory. The unit of analysis in the first image, in the individual level, is the person. Okay? There are, you know, other factors that comes into that person, and I'll explain them as we go along. In the state level analysis, okay, the second image, this is called the second image, the main unit of analysis is the state. Okay? So a classical realist, for example, precisely because they think states are the key units of analysis, will look at specific attributes of that state to understand why Iraq invaded Kuwait. If you're a classical realist, and you have to be doing state level analysis then, the key argument or the key proposition that comes is the national self-interest of the state, which we will do when we do realism. But the basic point is, from the realist perspective, who the individual leader is plays relatively limited role. If you go down to pluralism, okay, under the pluralist paradigm, you have theories, okay, individual IR theories, okay, specific IR theories that focuses on who the individual leader is, what kind of personality traits the individual has, and links, basically ties international events directly to that person. Okay? So if realism is the theoretical framework you're using, you are focusing on the state. Okay? You're not looking into the individual. Okay? But that doesn't mean, okay, we are trying to explain one event, okay? Event X, Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. Okay? That doesn't mean that you have only one explanation. That's very important. Okay? We have multiple explanations in international relations. You can understand the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait by looking at the leader, by looking at the Iraqi state, by looking at the international structure in 1990. Okay? Now, what kind of units you choose, the individual, Iraqi state, or the international structure in 1990, is shaped by which theoretical framework you're using. Okay? So that's the reason why we have these multiple images, realism, pluralism, and globalism. All of these images have different understanding of what the key unit of analysis should be. Okay? Parallel to this different unit of analysis, they also have a different weight assigned to the relative role of the actors. Okay? So when I say a theory is state-centric, okay, the word state-centric, when I say a theory is state-centric, what I mean is that that theory, in order to understand a specific event, is looking at the state as its key unit of analysis. Okay? Realism is state-centric. Okay? Democratic peace is state-centric. Liberal theory of IR, I think you have this in December, is state-centric. Okay? So you have multiple theories in international relations that focuses on the state only. Okay? And discounts the role of the other levels of analysis. Okay? So a state-centric analysis would basically focus its attention on specific attributes, specific factors that relates to that state. Realist state-centricism comes from the realist focus on national self-interest. Okay? Democratic peace state-centricism comes from the differentiation between a democracy and a non-democracy. Liberal theory of IR, Moravcik state-centricism, comes from his analysis of the different social groups that make up the state and the internal bargaining between these social groups, leading to one final foreign policy. Okay? But what matters now in this first week is to understand that first and foremost there are multiple numerous ways, okay? More than one way to understand international relations. Okay? One type of an explanation, Ali Can's explanation on Saddam, the bad guy. That's only one type of explanation. Doesn't mean there are no other explanations. Okay? But at the same time, it doesn't mean that one explanation, and this is also very important for you to understand, one explanation is the absolute ultimate truth. There is no such thing. Okay? If you have a different framework, the minute you have a specific theory backing your analysis up, you can have an explanation that will radically differ from your friends' explanations. Okay? And the important thing is neither is wrong, nor is the other one correct. Okay? You can explain the very same thing in multiple different manners. Okay? And that's why we use theories to start with. Okay? That's the reason why we have IR theories. Okay? If you just explained, for example, Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, saying, morning of August the 2nd, the Iraqi military with its tanks, tops, and what have you, marched into Kuwait, and then Saddam's armies went through the whole, it's a very small country anyway, went through the country in its entirety in 2 minutes and dissolved the government and said Kuwait exists no more. This is a description, right? That would basically be a description. And who makes descriptions? Who describes these international events? What kind of a job group, let's say? No, describe. If you're an IR theorist, then if you're describing, you're not an IR theorist, you're something else. Who describes? who basically gives you the facts, okay? Iraq, March, military man this much, Kuwait overtaken in 2 hours, government dissolved, and then there is no more Kuwait anymore. Who does this? Journalists. Okay, yeah, but historians to a certain extent as well, but journalists basically, okay? So there is a, you can actually get this training and you can become a journalist. But journalists' first and foremost responsibility is to describe the facts on the ground, okay? So they say, well, Iraq invaded Kuwait, period. But then an IR theorist does something else, okay? The IR theorist uses these facts to understand why that thing happened. Okay? Not how it happened. How is description. Okay? If you're describing something that happens, okay, that's not necessarily science. Okay? It's just reporting. So there is a key difference between what an IR theorist does than what, let's say, a journalist would necessarily do. Okay? So if you give just the facts, that's a description. On its own, a description, no matter how well it is made, is not going to enable you to understand why something has happened. Okay? So in IR theory, this is precisely what we are trying to do. We are trying to understand why that thing happened, not necessarily how it happened. Okay? How it happened and what necessarily happened. Okay? How and what are the descriptive questions, okay? These are not what IR theorists would necessarily look into. They would be important as facts, but only as facts, okay? You have to go beyond the facts to understand why something is happening, okay? So explanation is the key, not necessarily description, but explanation. And that's the reason why we have science to start with, okay? Now, how you explain, and this is again an important distinction, let's say, between social sciences, to a certain extent physical sciences, how you explain is multiple, okay? And it's the multiplicity of these explanations that we are going to learn in this semester, in this class, okay? The fact that there are multiple explanations, however, and this is critical, doesn't mean one explanation is superior to the other, and it doesn't mean that one explanation in its entirety gives you the whole story. Okay? So most often you can actually see this as a very large picture, parts of which can only be understood when you use multiple levels of analysis together, okay? But nonetheless, all IR theory that you're going to learn in this semester have a specific unit of analysis it chooses as its key understanding variable, as its key, let's say, dependent variable, which you probably don't know at this time what a dependent variable is. But the individual level analysis then, okay, takes the individual as its key unit of analysis. It does not say other factors don't play a role, okay? So if you are looking into an individual level analysis perspective, there is nothing there that implies that none of the other levels would play a role, okay? But it just implies that that theory is narrowing down its focus on one factor that could be isolated from others, okay? Who the leader is, let's say, okay? And once you isolate your explanation around who the leader is, the other factors, state and system, play a relatively little role in your explanation, okay? Now, the state level analysis, we said, looks into the key attributes of the state. Realism, okay, which we will have 3 weeks on realism, looks into two very important elements: states' national self-interest, okay, and states' power. Okay? Now, let me just go into that for a second. What do you think would be the key national self-interest for all states. What could we, well, let me ask it in a different manner. When you woke up this morning, all of you got up, did a thought cross your mind that by 5 o'clock tonight, God forbid, you would be dead? When you wake up in this morning, did you fear that at the end of the day, you would be dead? Does this thought occur to you? Why not? Does a state like Turkey, like United States, like Iraq, operate around the same principle that you guys operate? You wake up in the morning, you don't think you're going to be dead by the afternoon. When you see a threat, that's the car coming towards you, or a man with a gun, okay, when you see a threat to your survival, you take action, okay? You run or do something else, okay? Now, do states operate on the same instinctive principle? Yes, okay? So that's realism. Realism tells you that all states have a key national self-interest. That's what Deniz have said. That's survival, national security. All states want to survive, right? Now, all states want to survive implies that they would like to continue living as they are, okay? Turkey wants to protect its territorial integrity. You don't want to lose a piece of land, okay? It might not necessarily mean it would be the end of that state, okay? But you also would like to keep your, like you want to keep your body one piece, you want to keep your territorial integrity. So for states, survival, that is continuing to live as that state, and protecting the territorial integrity of that state, plus, not only you want to protect your territorial integrity, you also want the population that lives on that land that you call your territory to survive. So you want the state, territory, and population to remain intact. Selin? That's a good question. No, survival is still what the individual leader would operate on in individual level analysis as well. But there could be instances where a leader or a state could basically decode the information that is available to them in a fashion that is not necessarily correct. Okay, so they could, for example, misperceive a specific event as a non-threat, then take actions that might eventually lead to their demise. Okay, so it's like this, for example. Let's assume it's Selin. Okay, Selin is walking at night, 3 o'clock in the morning. Let's say in, give me a location. Where would you like to walk alone at 3 o'clock in the morning? Huh? Yeah. No, give me a location, any location. Let's, Taksim. Okay, so 3 o'clock in the morning in Taksim. Is Taksim that dangerous now? No. Okay, so there might, well, anyway, so it's 3 o'clock in the morning, and she sees, a group of guys with, knives, chains, what have you, coming towards her, okay? So what is the first impulse that she would have? Run away. Well, no, run away is the action, okay? In order to come to running away, you have to first decode that information, okay? So she's walking on the street, she knows her situation. It's not, there are not many policemen around, so that's another information. And she sees this group of guys who comes towards her. So first, there is information, okay? 3 o'clock in the morning, information. She's alone, information. Looks around, no policeman, information. A group of guys that she can actually see, observe, holding guns, what have you, chains, knives, information. Tamam? So, what does she do with that information? Huh? Well, she first has to observe. Tamam? She first has to observe that information. Okay? Now, a similar example is this. Norway in 1940, exactly like Selin in Taksim, okay? Norway is looking around, trying to see what's happening, and it sees the German Navy in the Baltic Sea coming towards Norway. So there is the very visible, concrete evidence. German Navy is coming towards Norway. Exactly like Selin walking in Taksim has the physical observation that 6 guys with knives are walking towards her. So the observation, first you need to observe that reality. Then you have to filter that reality into something else, okay? So the Norwegians say, we have a treaty of non-aggression with the Germans. Germans are our friends. They're probably on their way to the North Pole. They're not coming to invade us, okay? So they're filtering this information, okay, is in such a way that they decipher the already existing information in such a way that they don't perceive the threat that exists as such. So that answers Selin's question. It doesn't mean survival is not the key instinct. Survival is still there. You just don't see the threat to your survival. Okay? So Norway in 1940 did not see the threat to its survival. And when the Nazi Navy invaded Norway, they were taken by surprise. Okay? So in Selin's case, okay, those 6 guys that are walking towards her, she might actually decode this in 2 ways. She could perceive this as a threat. She could say, okay, they're going to attack me, get my money, do something. I have a threat here. So what was your name? Yeah. Aslı's comment, run away, is an outcome that she builds on based on her perception of the threat. Okay? So she runs away, takes action to prevent an attack that actually hasn't occurred yet. Okay? So she takes an action based on an assumption. Okay? That's an assumption. When she sees that group of people walking towards her, she assumes they are going to attack her. We don't know. Okay? We wouldn't have the slightest clue whether they really are going to attack her until what time? When we would be 100 or she would be 100% that they're going to attack her? When the actual attack occurs, exactly. Okay? So until that moment, until the actual attack, you are operating on a set of assumptions. You're assuming the attack will occur. And the actions you will take, running away, as Aslı have said, for example, is basically a response to an assumption that you made in your minds. Okay? Exactly like Norwegians made an assumption that the German Navy is not going to attack them because they have a treaty. Okay? Both turns out, or both could turn out to be faulty. Okay? Or both could turn out to be correct. We don't know yet. So in answer to Selin's question, okay, it's not the survival that changes as an instinct from individual to individual, from state to state. Okay? But it's how these actors, the individual or the state, perceives possible threats to its survival. Okay? You could, and this is actually very important in international relations where there are, tons and tons of articles and books written on it, you could perceive a threat when there is actually no such threat. So you could actually declare war, take action, run away, do something based on an assumption that you will have an attack. And if this is not the case, if it's actually a faulty assumption, you might find yourself in a worse situation than you were before, basically because you took action. Okay? Or the other possibility is, the second possibility, there might actually be a threat, okay? As in the Norwegian case, but you just assume that there is no such threat. So when the actual attack occurs, you are defenseless. So it's not the survival instinct that changes here, which more or less remains constant, but what actors, individuals or states, perceive as threats to their survival. Okay? And that's a very critical key difference. Okay, so we said all states operate, and this is actually, I have it here, all states operate around certain key interests. And realism says these are more or less constant for all. Right? Now, the security interest is the first and foremost. You could also think of this as having an level of prioritization on their own. Right? So certain states don't prioritize security as a statement cannot hold true. Okay? All states, first and foremost, operate on their key interest, which is survival. Okay? To guarantee your survival, like Dennis have said, okay, is translated into the security interest. Okay? Now, the security interest is, it encompasses both the protection of territorial integrity and the protection of the population that lives on that territory. So security implies that the state wants to survive as one piece with the people that lives on that piece of land. So when, for example, Basques in Spain, okay, try to break away from the Spanish state through ETA terrorism, that's all throughout the 1980s, 1990s, that's a threat to Spanish security. So the Spanish state responds by crushing, more or less, that ETA terrorism. Okay? So the threats does not have to be necessarily completely external. Okay? The Basque problem in Spain is internal. Okay? So threats to security could also come from the inside. If two parties want the same thing, what happens? If two different actors want to have the very same thing, what do you think we can call this? It's a conflict of interest. Okay? It's a conflict of interest. So, and the conflict of interest actually is a natural outcome of the, well, the very nature of the product. When products, goods are finite, okay? There is finite means there is a limitation, okay? When there is a finite element of these goods, okay, it means the more one player consumes that good, the less there would be for the other player. Okay? So it's the nature of the resources. Finite means scarce. It's the scarcity of resources that makes China and Japan face a conflict over that land today. Because if China rules the land, Japan will not. If Japan rules that land, then China will not. Okay? So precisely because the resource itself, that piece of land, is finite, okay, it's, you know, it's something that has limits, and it's scarce, okay? If one consumes, the other cannot. They find themselves in a conflict of interest, okay? Now, then this takes you to one of the key elements in realism, which again we will constantly come back to in the semester, which is that when states operate along these key assumptions, they also find themselves in constant struggle with other states, precisely because the nature of international politics is such that it's defined by scarcity of resources. Okay? Land is scarce. Okay? If, for example, West Bank and Gaza become sovereign states, Israel will lose that land. Okay? It's not going to, the land is not going to replicate itself. So Israel finds itself in constant conflict over that land with the Palestinians. Okay? The Iraqis and Iranians, they fought from 1981 to 1988 over a small piece of land which they both wanted to rule. Okay? Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, okay, it wanted to control the Kuwaiti land because the Kuwaiti land had also the oil resources. So by controlling the oil of Kuwait, Iraq will have, now Deniz and Aslı's power, will have more power, okay? Which we will come to eventually in this class. So security is a key element to define what states' interests revolve around, but protecting your own security or guaranteeing your own survival is not an easy feat. It's not very easy to do, precisely because when you try to protect your own key interest, you might eventually find yourself at an inevitable conflict with other players trying to do the same thing. Okay? So this is essential in terms of, for example, the realist analysis of international politics. This is essential in realism to understand state behavior, not who the leader is. Okay? Because once you formulate the process as such, it really doesn't matter if China is ruled by Ching Ching Chong or Chang Chang Chung. Okay? They would basically do the very same thing. Okay? It would mean that they would have the same perception of the situation, and the key interest of survival wouldn't change. Again, touching back to Selin's question, who the individual leader is. Okay? So state level analysis. Okay? The second level of analysis that we use in international relations takes you beyond the individual. It doesn't really pay attention, or that much attention, let's say, to who the leader is, but basically argues that all states operate around the same objectives, of which the most important is security, survival. Okay? Now, then comes in the third image. And the third image basically says, well, all of these could be correct, who the individual, who the, what the state has, but there is another layer that guides it all. There is a third level that we need to take into account to understand international politics, and that has nothing to do with the individual leaders, and that has nothing to do with the states, and that's the international system. Now, the international system as a tool of analysis is the third image. Okay? I know your time is up. So to sum up, we'll continue from here on Tuesday. We have 3 levels of analysis in IR theory. The first image is individual level analysis. Your focus is on the leader, the person, and humankind, which I haven't yet gone over. State level analysis looks at state attributes. Okay? It could be the national self-interest, realists. It could be the type of a political system, pluralists. Okay? But it could be something about the state. Okay? Something about the state and its attributes. The third one is the international system, where you look at the multiple factors that makes up the international system, such as distribution of capabilities, distribution of information, interdependence, what have you. Okay? So 3 different levels of analysis enable you, and this is critical, enable you to have an explanation of a certain event. Why did Iraq invade Kuwait? Was it because it was Saddam? Was it because it was Iraqi national self-interest? Or was it because it was the end of the Cold War, systemic collapse and uncertainty? Okay? All of these play a role. Okay? So different ways of understanding the very same event is what's critical in international relations theory, which you will actually learn in this semester. Okay gençler.